Hi, BookTube, it's Amy. I finished reading another novel by Honoré de Balzac. This is one of his lesser-known novels titled Beatrix, and I have to say, although I did enjoy reading it, it's not one that I'm going to be returning to, just because it was somewhat mediocre in terms of Balzac's writing. It's one of his longer works, so it's not a novella, it was a proper novel. But in terms of the plot, it was one where Balzac seemed to be meandering all over the place before he finally got to the point in the plot of his story. So we begin with a set of characters who are not the main characters we follow throughout the rest of the novel, and Balzac provides us the rules of a card game. We begin with a group of people gambling, and Balzac feels the need to explain the rules of this card game to us. And then we are finally introduced to Camille and to Caliste. And Camille is a woman of about the age of 40, and she has never married. She is a famous author who writes under a pen name. She comes from great wealth, and so because she has that wealth and doesn't have the need to marry, or I guess the guidance or the urging of relatives to marry, she has reached that age of about 40, unmarried, and supposedly never having really fallen in love with anyone, although she would tell you that she had. And she insists that she is not in love with the 20-year-old Caliste, a young man who is very much in love with her. Caliste's mother is very distressed at the thought of her son, running over to this older woman's house and spending all his time there. There are plans within the family for Caliste to marry, I believe, one of his cousins, and to sort of reinforce the family money and buy back land on the family estate and sort of concentrate that wealth for the next generation. Caliste has no interest in marrying. There's Charlotte, who is sent for to come and visit for an extended time with the hopes the two young people will fall in love. Charlotte comes believing that Caliste is going to pay attention to her, because she has pretty much been told since a very young age, since birth, that her family, the families, have planned for her to marry Caliste, and so she is sad and almost insulted when she realizes that he is, in fact, not interested in her at all. But Camille spends, I would say, 2 or 3 full pages here explaining the physical features and the character of a friend of hers, Beatrix, who is coming to visit. And this is where I had some trouble, because we have characters saying one thing, perhaps having other motivations, telling characters that they said one thing but had another motivation, but then they have a third motivation on top of that, to the point where I sort of had to wait for Balzac to have characters act to figure out what their true motivations or thoughts or feelings were. So Camille explains to Caliste that Beatrix is going to come, and Camille may or may not have some motivations there. It's unclear at first. Does Camille want to push Caliste into Beatrix's arms for an affair? Beatrix is a married woman who is currently separated from her husband when she comes onto the scene. Or does Camille want to seem to push Caliste into Beatrix's arms, while secretly sabotaging their relationship with the hope that Caliste is going to come back to her even though she's rejected him? Or is Camille doing something else entirely? It's unclear, and I'll leave it to you if you choose to read this story, just to figure out what everyone's motivations are, because it's very complicated, it's very complex, But what it comes down to is Beatrix is a story about a marriage where an affair destroys it. It's also a story about kind of a obsessive love that destroys a man's life. And it's tragic. It's tragic all around. It doesn't end happily for anyone at all. And then we have some downright complicated scheming at the end. Scheming to the point where I had trouble following just exactly what this chain of events, what this chain of dominoes one of the characters was setting up, was meant to do, and how, even with Balzac explaining every step of it, it wasn't until, the very end that I was able to figure out what the aim of that scheming was. And even then, I wasn't entirely understanding exactly how all those events were meant or were predicted to lead to the outcome of the story. So not one of Balzac's easiest works to follow, and at some parts a little bit slow, a little bit boring. Balzac seemed to be trying to up his word count here. It's not every day where an author spends, pages explaining the exact, the placement of somebody's eyes, how they look, and the rules of a card game. And it seems to turn out that maybe the card game was not relevant at all to the story. I suppose you could make a stretch about the card game being, an allegory or a metaphor for things that happen later on in the novel, but not really. It just kind of meanders all over the place. And I would say one of the good things about it is Balzac sort of perfectly portraying this tragic romantic character of Caliste's eventual wife, and the negative, at times almost melodramatic, impact that affairs and cheating have in a marriage. I had to laugh at a few points because there was one particular scene where Caliste quite literally pushes Beatrix to the point where she almost falls to her death. And Beatrix sees it as this great romantic gesture, and I was like, oh my god, that is like cursed from the start. Well, not as a romantic gesture, but as a romantic action. It seems to make her attracted to Caliste in some way, because he's sort of proven his love. And of course, 21st century would be like, red flag, huge red flag, run from that man. But no, in this particular story, that causes her to be more attracted to Caliste. And of course we have one of those classic scenes of early literature where a woman is literally pining away physically because her love has left her, and takes ill to her bed and nearly dies. In fact, several people take ill to their beds and nearly die over love in this story. So, yes, overall one of Balzac's most melodramatic, most over-the-top, romantic stories. It's almost as though, Balzac were inspired by Goethe or something. Which not usually a plot point that I appreciate all that much. Someone getting so obsessed with somebody that is not in love with them, to the point that they ruin their own life and everybody else's life, and they stop eating, stop sleeping, want to follow this person across the globe, because that's not love, that is just insanity. But that is Balzac's Beatrix, one of the many works of Balzac's that deal with love, with marriage and with adultery or affairs. But I will leave it at that. The next one in this volume here is titled The Atheist's Mass, and I haven't even ventured to begin reading it, but I probably will in the next few days. Beatrix was 352 pages long. The Atheist's Mass is significantly shorter, to the point where it looks to be somewhere between the length of a novella and a short story. But I will be back here to BookTube to talk about that one later on.